Welcome back, everybody, to Dungeon Brew. This is our world building series, and John and I are going to talk about technology today. This is oftentimes goes hand in hand with magic in terms of which one you're utilizing the most within your game, but we want to kind of get into the nitty gritty of this and look at how you want to consider technology when you are building the world for your campaign. And if you would start us off. Technology in the modern age, we usually think of our computers and our cell phones and that type of thing. But when we're looking at tech within a Dungeons and Dragons or a ttrpg role-playing game, that's not really what we're talking about. So can you give us some definition before diving into what you do with this particular element? Are you looking for a new grim, dark steampunk setting to introduce to your players? Well, Dungeon Brew has created a campaign setting manual called Thigum, and it is now available for your support on BackerKit. It has new rules for magic disruption in regions. There are rules to create your own corrupted gods to introduce to your players. There are new rules for mechanics in regards to the firearms for the new steampunk weapons that are being introduced, and there is new magic, new species, new subclasses, new factions, and so much more that's being included in this manual. You can go download a PDF sample on the BackerKit and see what all we have put into it, but right now we need your dice at our table, so head on over. We'll see you there.
Sure. So let's unpack some of that. So to begin with, what we're talking about when we're talking about technology. I think that you're right. A lot of people are going to think about modern technologies. If they're trying to think about this in relation to an older era, they'll think about some other things. They'll think about, I think, usually first weapons and armor, that type of stuff, which changes based off of the time period that you're talking about. It changes based off of how warfare has developed over time and that type of thing. But beyond just talking about weapons and armor, which we will get into, you also have to consider things like communication, how communication developed, how travel developed, how things like farming practices or medicine, those types of things have changed over time. None of those things are super linear, or not all of those things are super linear when you think about it. Sometimes things kind of have a weird trajectory where you kind of look at where things began and then kind of get to where they are now, and it's a very confusing, winding road that gets you from point A to point Z. Mm-hmm. So to begin with, I think that we're kind of move a little bit backwards in time on this when we're talking about technology in relation to creating a fantasy world, because it's kind of easier to relate to things that are closer in time. I run a number of settings where I like to do kind of steampunkish rules, and you've played in some of those games. I know that you've incorporated a little bit of that from time to time in games that you've run. But I have a tendency to incorporate things like firearms into those games. And the interesting thing about that is that oftentimes they're commingled with things like armor from medieval type periods, which does not make a ton of sense, but it's definitely something that I like to do. But when we're talking about that type of era of technology, you can incorporate things like cannons, gunpowder, firearms, that type of stuff. You start to get into, especially if you're doing like really intense type steampunk stuff, you start dealing with mechanical men, which would be something like Worldforge, which is a mixture of magic and technology. One of the games that I ran, you guys had clockwork or steam-powered automatons that you had to encounter from time to time. Man, that word I'm not going to say again. You also had to deal with things like how that technology influenced the way that people viewed the world, and usually the higher technology is, kind of the lower magic ends up being, because it's associated with advancement of the scientific type. But you can definitely have a commingling of high magic and high fantasy, and that's where you get in eras or in settings like Eberron. So there's a variety of ways to approach this in terms of where technology fits in. But I want to cover just like 2 or 3 more things in relation to this, and then I'm going to pass this off to you so you can talk about mid-tech here in a little bit. High-tech, when we're talking about communication, you can talk about telegrams, telegraphs, Morse code type stuff. So there's means of having fast and frequent communication. There's usually a greater tendency towards people being literate, which means that there are things like paper in mass production, people being able to write easily. They're not necessarily relying on papyrus and that type of thing, and low literacy rates. Medicine has some development, but this is one of those ones where it gets real squirrely, because even in our own history, it wasn't until like the 19th century where the notion of washing your hands came up, and it definitely didn't become normal practice until much later than that.
Some people are still struggling with that.
Some people are still struggling with that. So in terms of like medicine, it's definitely one of those things where it kind of lags behind everything else that's going on in terms of technology. It's just, it relied on things that people simply didn't understand because they couldn't see it. You can't see germs. You can't see what's going on in terms of what things are causing an illness. But interestingly enough, they definitely had ways of coping with it. They knew that the water was making them sick, which is why that throughout history there's a tendency to drink wine and beer, because those were the ways that they were able to sterilize the water to make it safe enough to be able to drink. So, and then in terms of travel was something where, by the 17th, 18th, 19th century, you had ships that were able to traverse the oceans at relatively quick speed, especially in relation to historical practices. You had people who were traveling. You had the first automobiles being invented at the end of the 19th century, that type of stuff, which if you wanted to incorporate those things into your setting, those are all possible. But it gets very broad when you're talking about high tech, because there's almost no limit, especially with steampunk, because you can take almost any modern technology and throw a bunch of gears in it and then call it steampunk, and that's a tendency that occurs quite frequently. So would you get back into our traditional fantasy settings with all of those things being said, just kind of like to help us provide a little bit of contrast for what's going on in terms of tech?
So if we're taking ourselves back into a medieval time period and looking at what the technology looked there, it's much different than, of course, the advanced stuff that you're talking about, John. Back in medieval times, things like communication and travel are really slow. You're using carrier pigeons, you're on horseback, you may have boats available to you to get from point A to point B, but it's tedious, it's dangerous, and those are going to be reflected in that world as well. You may not even have as many areas, of course, that have been explored, which are going to cause other dangers, of course, during travel. Mm-hmm. But in terms of military, there's also aspects to consider. I mean, we're looking at pre-gunpowder, pre-muskets on the battlefield.
Right.
So your knights are primarily your driving force there. You have men in full suits of armor on horseback that are just a force to be reckoned with. These, of course, came a little bit further into the medieval period for when they came upon the battlefield, and they were in response to other things that we've seen. Whether it's we talk about what the English longbowmen and the power of their arrows, and
right,
how the different development in armor and even strategy reflected that. And you mentioned this really well, I think, before we came on, about how the advancement of technology oftentimes was a reflection of conflict that was occurring between individuals. And we see this being true as well when we're looking at the longbowmen that come up on the battlefield, the knights that are in response to that, and eventually gunpowder that was a response to the knights that couldn't be defeated on the battlefield too, or at least were very difficult to defeat.
Right.
But yeah, a lot of other pieces, of course, come into the technology during the middle time period, whether we're looking at how food production is, how different settlements are being built, what types of resources are available to them to build those. And of course, the further we go back, the fewer and fewer technological pieces are available to the folks, especially when we're looking at farming and distributing food and resources out to people.
Yeah. And that's the same line that I was talking about with 19th century style medicine. In the medieval era, they were still dumping their chamber pots in the streets and stuff like that. They didn't really have any notion of what was healthy and what wasn't healthy in a lot of regards, but they still had the presence of mind to know the water's making me sick, I should drink beer. So it was very, again, it's squirrely and it's strange on the things that go on, but and anybody who's working on world building, you don't have to be perfect on this stuff, but those small details we've talked about before kind of add some breath and life into the world, where you have your players who are going through with a kind of a modern mindset, and they walk into this massive city and they're like, wow, it's so big and it's so crazy, and then there's like a chamber pod that gets dumped on their feet from the upper story window, and it smells terrible walking through the city. You have a bunch of unwashed bodies and people who don't know how to dispose of rotten or
I just have that vision from
so
I just had that view of Monty Python as he's walking around with the cart, bring out your dead, and they're throwing all the dead people on the cart to wheel around town, around everybody.
Yeah. It's interesting, though, because, even in this time period, I mean, you're talking about the bubonic plague, you're talking about the Black Death, they still had the notion in this time period of quarantining. Like, they didn't have a notion that it was unhealthy to have, things that come out of you in the street, but they had the notion that if that person's sick, I should stay away from them. So it is odd for some of
what
that
was
stuff, but
what was the name of the different biles that they try to keep balanced during that time period too? Your black bile, your yellow bile.
It was the four humors, and black bile, yellow bile, which I think black bile had to do with your liver, yellow bile had to do with your stomach. I would have to go back into it, but it's something I've come across definitely before, but I do not remember specifically. Blood was definitely one of them, because they had the tendency, if they thought you had too much blood, they would use leeches, which I don't know if that's true or if that's something that I've heard is incorrect. But
and the interesting piece too is going back to that idea that in a medieval time period, oftentimes as a dungeon master, when you're creating that world, because the medicine is not as advanced, you oftentimes rely on magic to counterbalance that piece to allow your adventurers to continue moving forward. So you have a lower tech and sometimes a higher magic in those settings in order to counterbalance some of those pieces that you just can't, reason your way out of.
Yeah, and I don't want to get really far into this idea, but this is part of the reason, part of the balance that I see there is to have magic be something that is not perfect in these regards, because you start to struggle with verisimilitude if you have the ability to generate a magical potion that acts as mostly a cure-all or a cure disease or something like that. Like, you have those things, and they're generally in a lot of D&D style settings not difficult to make. So the notion I've had, which I haven't had time to develop, is the idea of there being some kind of buildup of toxin that occurs if you're overusing that type of magic, where it's you can take your healing potion, but it's addictive, and if you keep taking healing potions, then it builds up in your system and causes other problems.
Then we're going to have to put leeches inside of your liver to get rid of all that black bile.
That sounds terrible, but
I know.
But that would be the idea, more or less, that it's you've been adventuring, and you've taken a lot of healing potions, and you have this buildup of arcane toxicity in your system, and if you're not careful, it's going to kill you.
We're going to send you down to Sam the medicine man, who doesn't know shit. He just cut open a lot of old carcasses, and he's got a plan for you.
I don't want to get too far into that idea. I like it. I just haven't had a chance to develop it at all with all the other stuff I'm working on. But let's keep going backwards here. Let's keep going back towards Bronze Age, Iron Age technology.
Yeah.
And because really the focus has been, for world building, we are talking about Greek culture, or the Greek time period around the Peloponnesian War and that type of thing. And inverse to some of the stuff we've been talking about for the limitations of technology, there are actually a number of technological advancements that that existed during that time period, which I don't think that we necessarily realize. Thinking about like Darius the First, this was around 500 BC or something like that. His and I forget the name of the city. But the city that he built was a city that had irrigation tunnels all throughout and this was in the middle of the desert. So he would capture the water that was coming down off of the mountain, build irrigation tunnels underneath his city, and the entire city was green. You know, he had trees, he had grasses, he had all of this stuff. It looked like an oasis in the middle of the desert because they understood the technology of using water as it came down off of the mountain in order to irrigate and provide life to basically an area that would not normally support life. So when you're thinking about technology, remember that these people were not ignorant at this time. They had plenty of things at their disposal. Add to that his ability in terms of communication, because he had roads and these were the first roads that were really built like this, that extended all throughout Persia, all the way over to Turkey and Greece, and all the way down to Egypt, that he could send messages hundreds, thousands of miles in a very short period of time because he created way stations. And this is kind of the same idea as the Pony Express in the United States in the 19th century or so, where it's like you would get a messenger, put them on a horse, they would ride as far and fast as they could until they got to an outpost, and then they would hand the message off to a new messenger with a new horse and do the same thing, and they would fly down that road to try and get messages across his empire as quickly as possible. This is contemporaneous with Greek culture. So this is technology that existed at that time that is definitely usable. I know you keep trying to say something, so go ahead.
No, I would just say it is 6th century as well as when the Iron Age started, because of the iron deposits that were found in the Middle East, near the south. They really found large deposits of iron. They were able to start mass producing weapons, and this is why we see a lot of the tribes that were down there started to gain power and spread throughout the Middle East and grow because of their access to iron, where other civilizations didn't have direct access to that in those local tribe areas, and they were able to grow as well. And even upon looking at Darius, right?
I believe so, yeah.
It was 333 BC that Alexander the Great, started pushing across the east as well and expanding his empire from Greece and growing because of their technology being superior to some of those that they were facing and being able to expand across the land and spread the empire. Right. If I'm remembering correctly. I know that was the year, that was the time frame, but a lot of their success had to do with their technology advancements in war that challenged those that they were facing because they weren't able to contend with it.
Right. And these are all interesting notions. You're talking about iron. The Iron Age did come, but it was being commingled with the bronze. It's like any other technology.
It was.
An advancement of technology does not automatically, when you get to that time period, it doesn't roll out across the entire world. We know this even in our own time period with our own technology. If you look at poorer countries across the world, they do not have access to the same technology, and the same thing was true of that time period. You have to keep in mind that technology will not be universal. So something like the Iron Age came along, there are going to be civilizations who have started working with iron. You have civilizations that are still working with bronze. You have civilizations like Greece who are using both. The Spartans had bronze armor, bronze shields. They had iron short swords. They used both of those things, and they used them in the ways that they knew how. You have civilizations who are still going to be pre-bronze, possibly
using copper.
Yeah, they're still going to be using other forms of technology. And in terms of the Iron Age, and I don't know exactly what year this is, but I know that in Scandinavian countries, they were getting their ore deposits from swamps and from bogs because there was iron that would accrue in there, and then they would have to boil the slag, or they would have to get the slag out in order to be able to develop their own iron. So they had different aspects there.
That's fascinating.
If you're talking about technology in terms of advancing forward, especially if you're talking about fantasy races, it's an excellent option to have something like a dwarven culture who does have access to advanced technology like steel. Steel would be a huge one. This would be considered almost magical by comparison to bronze and iron. It is sharp, it is hard, it is flexible, it is the kind of thing that would make them legendary just in the sense of their ability to create a weapon that is far more effective than bronze or iron or definitely stone for any of those in comparison. So that suddenly that if you want to bring that in, it's like you don't have to get into magical weaponry. You can rely on technology here and say, hey, listen, steel is the magical weapon. That is your plus whatever sword or armor or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. I was just thinking, we've talked about the population and geography pieces, and these are, like we said before, all these start to intermingle with each other when you're world building to figure out what goes where, but knowing where your tin deposits are and your ore deposits are and your iron deposits are, let you know where you might position those races at to have access to them to make the world make sense when you're putting this together, so that you can do exactly what it is that you're talking about.
Well, and it also affects things like economy and that type of thing as well. You have the if technology is advancing, right? So they've been using tin, they've been using copper in order to make bronze. Suddenly, the iron is discovered as this valuable resource for war technology. The people who were suddenly poor and did not have access to these other materials have access to iron. And suddenly they're wealthy and they're powerful because they have iron, and prior to that nobody had it, and so them having access to it and then being able to utilize it gives them an advancement that those other people don't have, because the people who only have access to tin and copper and don't have access to iron are at a technological disadvantage. The only way they can get their iron is by either taking it from someone or by buying it from someone. And that is something that changes technology is something that changes the way that interactions occur between various peoples. So all of those things will feed in, definitely. And technology is one of those things that has huge impact on the way that different cultures interact with each other and the way that things change over time to make the world feel like it's living and growing, and it's not just something that is in a stagnant place that has never changed. It's stayed that way for 1,000 years past, and it's staying that way for 1,000 years in the future.
Yep, and I really appreciate that we're kind of like using that snapshot of Greek culture to kind of look at what that reflects when you're building a world for that particular time frame, because I understand that a lot within this element of technology can be very convoluted and very confusing and a lot to process all at the same time, especially when you're trying to build a realistic society for your players to walk through. So if you're challenged in doing that, I would just encourage folks to kind of have an idea of what the time frame is that they're trying to capture, and look for our time in our own history where you can kind of take a snapshot and try to mirror some of those same elements that you're seeing, whether it's food, medicine, warfare, whatever that may be, trying to have a similar snapshot to that and bringing that to life for your characters or your players.
Dungeon Brew.